Special thank you to my patrons for helping make this video happen. Also, a quick disclaimer, in making this video, the audio for the first part got a little corrupted. I tried gussing it up as much as I could, but it's still a little choppy. The problem resolves itself at this timestamp right here. Apologies, and I hope you enjoy the video. Where there is a military, there is likely an inter-service rivalry. While in a perfect world, each branch of the nation's armed forces would cooperate in their common goal of national defense, tribalism and self-interest can often get in the way. In most cases, these battles are simply fought within the halls of power. In extreme circumstances, these tensions devolve into separate yet parallel forces, operational sabotage, and all the other fun quirks of the Imperial Japanese military. An inter-service rivalry exists here in America too. For 364 days out of the year, the rivalry is indistinguishable from any other, existing in arguments over military budget and in the jeers of new cadets and midshipmen. But on one day a year, for 60 minutes out of the day, an annual battle commences. One of strength, one of strategy, one of will, one of war. A war that, for over 100 years, has captivated the American public. This is the Army-Navy game, the annual installment of the greatest rivalry in college athletics. But for me to fully back up that admittedly large claim, we need to go back and see it all. The rivalry began with a fullback. This is Dennis Mahan Mitchie, Army officer, future veteran of the Spanish-American War, and the captain of Army's very first football team. Having learned of the game at a boarding school in New Jersey, Mitchie would come to West Point with the goal of bringing the sport of American football with him. The Academy's leadership did not share the same enthusiasm, so he worked with his peers at the Naval Academy, who'd already established their football program 11 years prior, to help him bring the sport to West Point. The plan? A declaration of war. In the fall of 1890, the Navy midshipmen would challenge the future Black Knights to a game of football, a challenge Army accepted, playing the first Army-Navy game on their home turf. Naturally, Navy would handle the inexperienced cadets handedly in a 24-0 victory. But Mitchie's goal of an Army football team was achieved, and next year they'd be a little more ready. 1891 would see Army football's first win, a 10-6 victory over the in-state Fordham Rams, going on to tie Princeton's B team and rattle off 2 more wins going into their second ever Army-Navy game, this time in Annapolis, where the cadets would pay their cross-service rivals back with a dominant 32-16 victory. A couple years later, and a midshipman has a problem. Joseph Reeves has been a proud Navy footballer for 3 years now, but has recently been dealt a number of serious head injuries. His doctor wants him to stop, saying continued play would result in, quote, instant insanity or death. What's a future admiral to do? Well, Reeves would respond by going down to his local shoemaker and having a leather cap fashioned to protect his skull from the game of football, to be worn during that year's Army-Navy game. One of the first football helmets was born, alongside one of college football's first 5 mascots. Naval officers would regularly bring livestock, especially goats, aboard their ships to provide their crew with food and milk while on mission, an arrangement that led to a few sailors attaching themselves to their animal crewmates. On one occasion, in the late 19th century, one of these Navy goats would die at sea, and to honor their fallen comrade, the crew would take the goat to a taxidermy, skin him, and mount the pelt in his honor. Somewhere between the taxidermy and the port, though, was a Navy football game, and the officers entrusted with the goat skin decided to attend. Halftime comes around and they get an idea. dressing themselves in the goat belt and entertaining the crowd from the sidelines. Soon after, the midshipmen would come out victorious, all thanks to a ship's dead goat. A few years later, and Navy commissioned a live goat to attend the 1893 Army-Navy game. His name was El Cid, or the Chief, the mascot of the USS New York, and Navy's first goat, later to be given the name Bill. Following a 6-4 Navy win over the heavily favored Army cadets, the roughly 10,000 in attendance would erupt in energetic frenzy, especially a certain brigadier general, who ended up punching a rear admiral in the nose. A heated argument would ensue, and the admiral would challenge his rival to a duel, which may or may not have actually occurred. Nevertheless, this incident, alongside other skirmishes in the crowd that day, would necessitate an adult step in and deal with the feuding soldiers. Said adult was President Grover Cleveland, promptly canceling the burgeoning rivalry by forcing both academies to only play home games for the foreseeable future. Just as soon as it was born, Army-Navy was no more, for around 6 years. Under President William McKinley, through the constant lobbying of McKinley's Assistant Secretary to the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, Cleveland's ban on Academy away games, and by extension the Army-Navy game, was lifted, and the two rivals resumed play on December 2, 1899. The new Army-Navy game would come with a key difference to its pre-ban predecessor, though. It would be played midway between West Point and Annapolis, on Philadelphia's Franklin Field. It would be the first neutral site Army-Navy game, a tradition that would continue to the modern day, with Philadelphia becoming the rivalry game's primary host. Army would win the first post-cancellation game 17-5, with a very special guest in attendance. Figuring Navy couldn't be the only service academy with a live mascot, the cadets would go and find one of their own. They settled on an ice wagon carrying mule, the animal a long-standing friend of the Army and symbol of their resilience. A couple years later, in 1901, the rivalry would pay the former Assistant Secretary to the Navy back, with now President Theodore Roosevelt accepting an invitation to the 1901 Army-Navy game. This presidential visit would begin another tradition that had come to color this game, as Roosevelt would eventually be joined by 10 other presidents after him that make the pilgrimage out to see the military they commanded duke it out, with the most recent visit coming from Donald Trump in 2020. In 1905, for the first time since this rivalry's rebirth, the game would be played outside of Philadelphia. Despite primarily being played in Philadelphia, the game would be no stranger to other sites, eventually going as far as Chicago and California. Their first excursion, though, would be a little more local, playing in Princeton, New Jersey, where Army's 4-game winning streak would be snapped by the rivalry's very first tie. In the background of Army-Navy's early history, both academies were slowly evolving into some of early college football's biggest programs, with wins and ties over the old guard of college football alongside the other up-and-comers like Carlisle. The prestige of the service academies only grew as American football entered the 1910s. Soon, Army and Navy both would enter their multi-decade-long academy golden age. It began with Army's first national championship. They laid waste across their 1914 campaign, averaging 24.3 points per game and holding opponents to an average of 2.2 points per game. Among the many legendary players on the plane were a pair of future Hall of Famers, the first being halfback Elmer Oliphant, one of early college football's most prolific scorers, amassing both the single-game and single-season scoring records at both Purdue and Army. The other was lineman Robert Neyland, the father of Tennessee football, writer of American football's game maxims, and a host of other innovations to the game. He played first and foremost at West Point. Among the 1914 cadets' dominant victories were a 20-0 shelling of the midshipmen in Philadelphia, a 41-0 demolition of the Villanova Wildcats, and a 20-7 victory over a certain other Eastern independent up-and-comer, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. The bond Notre Dame and the service academies have is a fascinating one. A story of 3 programs gaining prominence and prestige at around the same point in college football's early development, and both becoming synonymous with some of this era's most famous personalities. These similarities would become even more obvious as each started to play each other, with the Irish beginning to play Army in 1913 and Navy in 1927. They are not college football's first programs, far from it, but they are some of college football's first brands. Some of the first teams to escape the bounds of school spirit and regional pride to reach national acclaim. The First World War would soon after come to America, with the service academies briefly shutting down the Army-Navy game to turn their full attention towards Europe. Soon after the game came back, though, Navy would begin assembling their very own super teams. The midshipmen would enter the 1953 Army-Navy game, held in New York City's Polo Grounds, with a deceptive 5-1-1 record, winning all of their games by a minimum of 2 scores, including a 61-0 blowout over Xavier, tying the Princeton Tigers, and notching a single loss to Penn State. Army, on the other hand, heading into New York City fresh off a campaign down south, notching wins over the likes of Auburn, Tennessee, and Florida. The stage was set for a classic, but the weather simply would not permit. A horrific storm would turn the playing grounds into a sea of mud. Passing was impossible, holding on to the ball was nearly impossible, and a flurry of missed kicks would ensure the game would end 0-0. The rivalry's first and only scoreless tie. The performance was still enough for Navy to be crowned, by the Rose Bowl at least, as the best team in the East, earning their first postseason bid to eventually tie the PCC champion Washington Huskies 14-14. 3 years later, Navy would be on the doorstep of their very first national title, going a perfect 9-0 going into Army-Navy with wins over Purdue, Princeton, and the eventual Western Conference co-champions Michigan. Army was all that stood in the way of Navy's perfect season. The Cadets were no pushover, however, going into Army-Navy 7-1. The venue for this pseudo-national championship would be a new one, Chicago's recently built Soldier Field, with the game serving to underline the stadium's dual purpose as a World War I memorial. The game would be a hard-fought back and forth between two of the East's strongest teams, with both cadets and midshipmen failing to gain an upper hand over the other. Among the 110,000 in attendance, the largest crowd in football history at the time, was Notre Dame head coach Knute Rockne, comfortable enough with his squad's ability to handle Carnegie Tech and by extension finish the season undefeated, to leave them to their own devices. The game would end in a 21-21 tie, leaving Navy with a small blemish on their otherwise perfect record. Thankfully for the midshipmen, though, Rockne's team would shockingly lose to Carnegie in his absence, leaving Navy as one of the nation's last 5 undefeated teams. The Academy's 2 ties in 1923 and 26 would sit within a larger 6-game Army undefeated streak, a streak that'd end in 1928. Not with a Navy victory, mind you, but another stoppage of the rivalry. On January 7th, 1928, Admiral Louis Knowlton and Major General Edwin Winans, representing their respective academies, met in D.C. to discuss the future of the rivalry, specifically the issue of player eligibility. They failed to come to an agreement, and like that, the rivalry, for the 3rd time, was put on hold while West Point and Annapolis sorted it out. The ceasefire would drag on until an economic disaster forced their hand. In 1930, America was knee-deep in the Great Depression, and in a move to alleviate the Depression, the Army-Navy game returned, with the majority of the proceeds going to the Salvation Army. The renewed rivalry would play in front of a sold-out Yankee Stadium, raising around $600,000 in the process, or $11 million today. Army's run of dominance would pick up right back where they left off in 1927, leaving Yankee Stadium with a hard-fought 6-0 victory. Army's undefeated streak would carry on for another 4 years, finally ending in 1934 off a 3-0 loss to the 8-1 Navy midshipmen. In 1940, Army is having a horrible season. For the first time since their founding in 1890, the Cadets had a single win to their name, going 1-7-1 throughout the season, a season that ended with a 14-0 Navy bombardment. Head coach of the Cadets, William Wood, would be called into active service shortly after, as American involvement in the Second World War felt more and more like an inevitability. To replace Wood would come West Point grad and Wisconsin assistant coach Earl Blake, the greatest coach in West Point history. World War II would create one of the most unique environments in the long history of college football, an environment of service academy dominance. It began with the maritime academies and pre-flight schools. They were temporary academies set up at numerous universities across the country, notably Georgia, North Carolina, and Iowa, who, to prepare their recruits for the physical strain of war, fielded football teams. These teams, separate from their neighboring universities, mind you, were often some of the nation's best, making use of nationwide recruits and some former pros to bolster their rosters. Then, a quarter of the nation's programs shut down, owing primarily to a lack of players to man their rosters, further limiting the competition and bolstering the academies. And then, there was West Point and Annapolis. Being America's premier military academies, it was only natural that they would benefit the most from college football's new reality. From 1942 to 1945, the two academies would field 15 Hall of Fame players, go a combined 57, 14, and 2, and play in two of the most impactful games of the 20th century. In 1944, the two played in the rivalry's first number 1 versus number 2 matchup, one of only a handful between any program in the Pole era. For the past 2 years, in 1942 and 43, the game had been moved back to West Point and Annapolis for the first time since the 1890s, playing in front of limited crowds to adhere to FDR's wartime domestic measures. It's a restriction that'd be lifted in 1944, with the game being moved to Baltimore with the condition that the attendees buy $25 war bonds to watch the game. The 70,000 in attendance gladly accepted, and were treated with a defensive bout between the nation's best. Entering the fourth quarter with a narrow 9-7 lead over the midshipmen, Army would break a Navy defense that would allow an average of 8 points across the regular season, scoring 2 late touchdowns to win the 1944 Game of the Century, and their second national title. To celebrate West Point's monumental win was one Douglas MacArthur, having returned to the front to retake the Philippines. When hearing of Army's win, he'd send a telegram back home to notify Blake, quote, "The greatest of all Army teams, stop. We have stopped the war to celebrate your magnificent success." Then came 1945, Army-Navy's second game between the nation's number 1 and number 2, and their first since the Second World War's end. The Cadets would enter Philadelphia as the nation's number 1 team, a position it hadn't relinquished since October 30th, 1944, partially through the play of Army's first and second Heisman, fullback Doc Blanchard, or Mr. Inside, and halfback Glenn Davis, or, quote, Mr. Outside. Navy, a dominant team all their own, entered with a pair of top 10 wins to their name, hoping this game of the century would go a little bit differently than the last. A 20-point Army first quarter would point to the contrary, and while the midshipmen would fight to make it a game, the Cadets would leave with a confident 32-13 victory, and their second straight national title. After the war came to a close, so too would the college football landscape it created. Programs like Stanford and Alabama would reopen, the temporary academies of Iowa, Georgia, and North Carolina would cease operation, and the service academies fell back to earth. Well, at least Navy did, notching 6 straight losing seasons after 1945. Against the odds, Earl Blake continued working his magic at West Point, going 9-0-1 in 1946, tying number 2 Notre Dame to split the 1946 title in 2. Earl Blake's success at West Point couldn't simply be put on the war. His 2-platoon system, separating offensive and defensive players, would completely revolutionize the way rosters were constructed. Blake would also, for a time, convince West Point's top brass to do away with their strict weight and height requirements for players, allowing Blake to field a nationally competitive line. Blake's Black Knights, as they would be called under his leadership, would continue to wreak havoc across the 40s, going undefeated yet again in 1948 and 49 with one small blemish, a 21-21 tying of the Navy midshipmen. Then, at last, Army would begin to cool down with the help of a scandal. Shortly before the 1951 season, 90 Army cadets, most belonging to the football team, would be discharged from the academy on the grounds of, quote, violating the moral code. These violations would primarily come from a widespread cheating scandal among the cadets on exams, leaving the 51 Black Knights with a skeleton crew, resulting in Earl Blake's first losing season. Despite the controversy, Blake would get his squad back to standard throughout the 50s, returning to the final AP poll in 1953, just in time for a grand heist. One of the neat things about live mascots is their tendency to get stolen. There's, of course, the 1933 capture and subsequent humiliation of Yale's Bulldog at the hands of Harvard. Then there's the 1963 capture of Bevo by Texas A&M. And in 1953, Bill the Goat would be captured by a group of cadets shortly before the Army-Navy game. The first of many live mascot kidnappings had followed from both West Point and Annapolis. Eventually, West Point's higher-ups would catch wind of the incident and return the goat to his home at the Naval Academy, with Bill giving Lieutenant Colonel George McIntyre hell throughout the entire ride back to Maryland. Doctors would soon attend to the animal, where he was thankfully cleared of any Army brainwashing, yet noted how uneasy he seemed to be in the, quote, enemy's camp. Army would end up beating Navy 5 days later, 20-7. The decade would also see the rebirth of Navy football under head coach Eddie Erdelatz, kicking off his tenure with a miraculous 14-2 upset over the Cadets, Navy's first win over Army in 7 years, and Army's first loss to anyone in 3 years. Navy would also return to the final AP poll in 1954 after nearly a decade of absence, finishing the season with a 27-20 victory over the number 5 Army Black Knights and a 21-0 blanking of Johnny Vaught's Ole Miss Rebels to finish the season at number 5. Although Annapolis and West Point both would find plenty of success throughout the 50s, it was becoming clear that the Academy Golden Age couldn't continue forever, a reality made crystal clear in 1958's Army-Navy game. It would be Earl Blake's last, as he'd retire from coaching the year after. His final squad would be among his best, going undefeated with wins over ACC runner-up South Carolina, Notre Dame, and of course, a 22-6 win over Navy, all while fielding Army's third and last Heisman in halfback Pete Dawkins. To this day, Blake holds West Point's record for both wins and years of service, coaching 3 of Army's 4 widely recognized national champions and all 3 of Army's Heisman players. Navy would similarly turn a page in 1958 with Eddie Erdelatz, the architect of the midshipmen's post-World War II rebuild, leaving Annapolis after 9 years of service, finishing his time placing 3rd all-time in both overall wins and years spent coaching. While Blake's departure would see an immediate drop-off for the Knights, Erdelatz's successor, Wayne Hardin, would keep the good times rolling for a few more years, beginning his tenure with a 43-12 domination of Army and a 5-4-1 record. Then, Hardin gave Navy one last grand hurrah. His midshipmen would begin the 1960 season with a couple confident wins over Boston College and Villanova, to then defeat the eventual 10-1 AAWU champion Huskies in Seattle. They'd go on to dominate their slate with one of the nation's best rushing attacks, led by Navy's very first Heisman, halfback Joe Bellino. Army would prove difficult to handle, though, holding Bellino in the midshipman offense to one of its season lowest point totals in a narrow 17-12 loss. Navy would go on to make the Orange Bowl and finish number 4 in the final polls. 3 years later, and Navy would field a team, one unlike any that would be fielded after it. The age of the Service Academy super team was just about over. The days of the military paying more than the NFL did were done, and there were few reasons for the nation's best players to join the academies over, say, Alabama or USC. Schedules were also getting longer, putting players that already had to fulfill their commitments as cadets and midshipmen at even more strain. Then, of course, was the renewed weight restrictions on players, working hand in hand with the reestablishment of separate offensive and defensive platoons to put Service Academy rosters at a permanent disadvantage. The final, and perhaps most impactful change, would come from the military itself. The establishment of the Air Force as a separate branch of the military. Divorced from the Army in 1947, the new Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado would soon field its very own football team, beginning play with the Knights and Midshipmen in 1959. On top of every other limiting factor on Army and Navy football, they now had to share a third of their already massively depleted recruiting pool with an entirely separate academy. The days of Army and Navy commanding the same on-the-field presence as Notre Dame, as had been the case for decades, was almost over. All that remained were the 1963 Navy midshipmen and their generational quarterback. He is likely the most famous individual to put on a Navy jersey, an immediate symbol of the quarterback revolution that take hold across the 60s. Captain America in the flesh, Roger Staubach. Beginning his collegiate career setting passing records at a small military academy in Roswell, New Mexico, Staubach would arrive in Annapolis in 1961, riding the bench his freshman year before being thrust into action in 1962. Usurping starter Ron Klemick of his duties in the middle of a game against Cornell, he'd lead the midshipmen to a 41-0 decimation of the Big Red in his first meaningful snaps of his college career. Staubach would finish his sophomore season averaging 14.4 yards per completion, a QB rate of 168.6, en route to a 5-5 record with highlight wins over Boston College, Pittsburgh, and of course a 34-14 win over Army. As impressive as his sophomore season was, it only served as a prelude of what was to come in '63. 7th in the nation in yards, 3rd in the nation in QB rate, 1st in completion percentage, 2nd in yards per attempt, and 1963's Heisman. Roger Staubach would bring Annapolis to a height they hadn't reached since World War II, a height they and Army would never reach again. They'd go 8-1 going into Army-Navy, ranked 2nd in the nation with notable wins over Michigan, Notre Dame, and a top 10 Pittsburgh. The stage was set for another Army-Navy classic. But right before it was set to begin, the commander-in-chief was gone. The reactions to John F. Kennedy's assassination at the service academies were similar to the reactions at Harvard and Yale. A son of all four institutions, taken in a moment. For the first time since the 20s, there were serious talks about canceling the game, but under orders of the First Lady, the cancellation never went through. In December of 1963, one of the best Army-Navy games to ever be played would commence in memory of John F. Kennedy. Army would draw first blood, driving down the field on their opening possession to take an early 7-0 lead. Then, after Navy's own plodding drive down the field, the Army defense would come up big with a goal line stand to keep their lead at 7. Staubach's offense couldn't be bottled up forever, though, and before too long, the midshipmen had scored 21 unanswered points, going into the fourth with a commanding 21-7 lead. A commanding lead that'd be put into jeopardy by the Black Knights' two-headed monster of a ground game, led by quarterback Rollie Stitchway and running back Ken Waldrop. They'd eventually find the end zone once more in the fourth, and after a successful two-point conversion, the cadets of West Point were within 6. The Navy offense would stall around midfield, and soon Army found itself on the doorstep of one of Army-Navy's biggest upsets. And then, the clock ran out. Army was left figuring out their next play as the clock winded down, and Navy came out of Philadelphia the victor, set to face the number 1 Texas Longhorns in the Cotton Bowl for 1963's de facto national championship. While Army was left to stew on the upset that could have occurred had there been a couple more seconds on the clock. Navy would finish second in the AP poll, tied for their highest ever finish. And with the 1963 season in the books, Service Academy football would never be the same. 1963 would be the last year either academy would finish ranked for 32 years. It would be the last either would beat Notre Dame for 44 years. And it would be the last year of Army-Navy's golden age. Army and Navy, as we know them today, were born. And soon after, they'd reached their lowest point to date. In 1970, the Army-Navy game was played between a 1-8-1 Army and a 1-8 Navy. Two programs that, a mere 10 years ago, fielded some of the nation's best teams were limping into Philadelphia with a combined 2 wins. The reasons for the downturn were clear and omnipresent. By 1970, America had fully involved itself into the Vietnam War. The World War II perception of the military as supermen and the optimism that perception brought were replaced with unease and cynicism. West Point and Annapolis would see the consequences of this change in perception firsthand, with both football programs sharply declining as America's involvement in the Vietnam War increased, culminating in their 1970 game. This malice would carry on into the early 70s, with 1973, America's last year in Vietnam, being Army's worst season to date, going 0-10, losing by an average of 31.5 points per game, and losing the Army-Navy game 51-0, the largest blowout in the history of the game. It was at last rock bottom, a trench Army would take 2 decades to slowly climb out of, just in time for the Commander-in-Chief series to begin. Starting in 1972 under infamous Commander-in-Chief Richard Nixon, the series would put Air Force on both Army and Navy schedules every single year, with the winner of the series getting the brand new Commander-in-Chief trophy. Army would win it twice throughout the 70s, with Navy taking the trophy home every other year. But as the Air Force Falcons fully established themselves as an equal member of the three-way rivalry throughout the 80s, they'd take a commanding lead in the series that they still to this day haven't given up. Going into 1983, Army-Navy had been played in Philadelphia for 39 straight years, with their last game outside of Pennsylvania being played during World War II. It was time for a change of scenery. A drastic change of scenery. The Rose Bowl, college football's most hallowed grounds, would host 1983's Army-Navy game. The first, and for the foreseeable future only, Army-Navy game to be played west of the Mississippi. The game would come with a commemorative bench, a commemorative time capsule, and 9,000 cadets and midshipmen flown out from the other side of the nation, housed by the people of Pasadena. What resulted was one of the most unique environments in college football history, as Navy dominated the cadets 42-13. It's around this point in the 80s where both Army and Navy would pivot towards an offensive philosophy that had come to define Service Academy football. In 1983, Army would hire former Purdue head coach Jim Young to dig them out of their 70s rut, and he did so with the triple option. The triple option, generally speaking, is a play built to provide a mobile quarterback with the ability to hand the ball off to a halfback, a fullback, or keep it himself, the titular 3 options. Many programs would come to use and love the triple option, with Tom Osborne's Cornhusker I formation and Darrell Royal's Longhorn Wishbone coming to mind. But it would imprint itself on these service academies more than any other university for one big reason. The academy's ever-present height and weight limits would leave them perpetually small and weak up front, so maintaining a clean pocket or creating running lanes through bullying the opposing D-line were both off the table. The triple option, more than most offensive philosophies, was not built on strength and talent, but deception and strategy, something the service academies had in spades. It's why these schools have been loyal to the triple option as long as they have, and why Army began climbing out of college football's cellar throughout the 80s. The Black Knights would make their very first postseason bowl in 1984 off a 28-11 victory over Navy, ending a midshipman unbeaten streak going back to 1978. Both would enter the 90s in a bit of a slump. Navy in particular would suffer some of their worst ever seasons in 91 and 92, with their only win of 1991 coming on behalf of a miraculous Army collapse. That being said, both would begin to collect themselves throughout the decade, culminating in a brief service academy renaissance in 1996. For the first time since 1963, both Army and Navy went into their game with winning records. Army was a staggering 9-1, on the doorstep of their first double-digit win season in program history, and ranked number 23 in the AP poll, their first appearance in the polls in 11 years. They were led by 1997's Mr. Irrelevant, quarterback Ronnie McAda, and a host of solid backs, finishing with a combined 3,800 rushing yards on the year. Annapolis was in similarly rare form, going 8-2 with wins over Duke, Wake Forest, and Georgia Tech, through the arm and the legs of midshipman quarterback Chris McCoy. The 96 Army-Navy game would kick off in the middle of a cold Philadelphia shower, and the matchup would naturally evolve into a hard-nosed defensive slugfest, with Army scoring first off a field goal. Navy would soon fire back, finding pay dirt to go up by 4, then 11, and then 18, leaving their hapless 9-1 rivals shell-shocked. Shell-shocked, but not defeated, as the Black Knights slowly worked their way back into the game with their first touchdown of the day, to then finish the second half with another field goal, cutting the lead down to 8. The cadets remained determined, muscling their way down the field to take a 25-21 lead. After a final trade of field goals, the largest comeback in Army-Navy history, alongside the cadets' first 10-win season, was in the books. It would end up being Army's last winning season for 14 years. Soon after, America would once again find itself at war, and the service academies entered an era of futility unseen since Vietnam, with Army, Navy, and Air Force all struggling to maintain players assembled during peacetime, and replace said players with recruits willing to join an at-war military. Army would have it worst of all, going winless in 2003, and finishing without more than 3 wins in all but 2 seasons across the 2000s. Navy would have it better, going winless in 2001 and finishing 2-10 in 2002 before returning to respectability with an 8-5 2003, almost entirely due to a single man, head coach and triple option guru Paul Johnson. Having previously served as the midshipmen's offensive coordinator in 1996, Johnson would go on to refine his flavor of the option at Georgia Southern, winning 2 FCS national championships in Statesboro before taking the job at Navy. He'd bring with him another man that'd be instrumental in Navy's 2000s turnaround, offensive line coach and assistant head coach Ken Nui Matalolo, a former running backs coach for Navy and Johnson's direct successor. Under these 2 head coaches, Navy would experience some of the greatest moments in its long history of playing football. They'd earned their second ever double-digit win season in 2004, finishing ranked for the first time since Roger Staubach, to then win 3 more such seasons from 2009 to 2019. They'd beat Notre Dame for the first time in 44 tries in 2007, ending the longest losing streak to a single program in college football history. They'd established themselves as a perennial power in their first ever conference, the stacked 2010's American Conference, and they'd enjoy the longest winning streak in Army-Navy football history, winning 14 straight from 2002 to 2015. Army desperately needed change to rebound from the early 2000s, and they found it, ironically enough, in another Georgia Southern sideline. Jeff Monken, like Nui Matalolo, was born in the triple option, serving as Paul Johnson's running backs coach at Georgia Southern, Navy, and Georgia Tech, before taking his first head coaching gig back at Georgia Southern, leading the Eagles to back-to-back FCS playoff runs and notching an upset over a certain SEC team en route to taking the top job at Army. His tenure would start slow, suffering a couple losing seasons to entrench his system, but once he started winning, he hardly ever stopped. 2016 would see Army's first winning season in 6 years, and second since 1996. A bowl win, and most important of all, the end of Navy's 14-game winning streak and a cathartic 21-17 win over the midshipmen. Then came more winning, reaching the 10-win mark the next year, alongside their first ever back-to-back bowl wins and first back-to-back wins over Navy in 21 years. Then an 11-2 2018, the most wins in an Army season ever, with wins over MAC champion Buffalo, a 70-14 evisceration of Houston in the Armed Forces Bowl, and a third straight win over Navy, alongside a 7-point loss to Kyler Murray's top 10 Oklahoma Sooners, all while leading the nation in rushing attempts and rushing touchdowns. These 2018 Black Knights, alongside the similarly dominant 2015 11-2 Midshipmen, were symbols of the best the triple option can be, the fruits of two of the most underrated program turnarounds in recent college football history. Johnson, Niumatalolo, and Monken's turnarounds were not just focused on the field of play, though. They were institutional as well. The goodwill these coaches built, alongside the desire for top brass at both Annapolis and West Point to see good football, would help push for changes in the lives of Army and Navy footballers. They'd get better accommodations, and their day-to-day routine was made a little bit more forgiving, all to give talented recruits a little more of a reason to choose Army and Navy instead of other Group of 5 schools or Air Force. The triple option is a fickle thing, though. When it's good, you're running perhaps the most infuriating offense for an opposing defense to line up against. You're getting the most out of your less talented roster. You're winning 10, 11 games a season. But when it's bad, it's debilitating. Georgia Tech, after Paul Johnson's retirement, would take years, painful, Jeff Collins-infested years, to wean off the triple option. And while the service academies would never quite do the same, one game would bring them to the brink. The 2022 Army-Navy game will go down in history as the first overtime game in Army-Navy history. But for me, on a personal college football fan level, it's way deeper than that. It is one of the worst football games I've ever watched live. A game that easily could have ended 0-0 had this been played in the 80s. It was a beautiful look at how bad the triple option could be. And here's how it went. Run up the middle, gain of 2. Run up the middle, gain of 1. A deep throw to nobody. Run to the edge. Blown up. That's the game. All 60 plus minutes of it. The first score of the game was a field goal in the second quarter, followed, of course, with a blocked Navy punt for Army's first touchdown. There wouldn't be a single offensive touchdown until the late third quarter, with a Navy run up the middle. A fourth quarter of offensive ineptitude later, an Army tied the game at 10. One of history's worst Army-Navy games went into overtime. Army got the ball first and immediately ran it up the middle to score their first offensive touchdown of the game. Navy then completed one of the game's 3 completed passes to send the game into double overtime, with the midshipmen driving to make it 25. Then, backed up to their own end zone, the Army defense would come up strong. One field goal later, an Army would come out of the longest Army-Navy game in history on top, with 10 first downs, 153 yards of combined offense, and a single offensive touchdown. The fallout from this game would be substantial on both sidelines, starting with the tarmacking of Ken Niumatalolo. Despite bringing Navy to heights they hadn't experienced since the 60s, a few disappointing seasons in a row would start to wear away at his goodwill. And this ugly game served as Annapolis' final straw, ending the 20-year-long Johnson-Niumatalolo era at Navy. Even after coming out of Philadelphia the victor, Monken realized change was necessary, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Which is why, immediately after Army-Navy, he began the unthinkable. An Army divorce from the flexbone option. Citing changes in NCAA rules regarding tackling, alongside a general Army downturn, Monken would begin shifting away from the triple option in favor of an inside zone spread with an emphasis on screens, an offense more akin to Urban Meyer's Florida than Darrell Royal's Texas. Despite the offensive evolutions on both sides, both Army and Navy's offenses would rank among the nation's worst in both yards and points per game, pushing Jeff Monken to reintroduce the triple option this season, which brings us to 2024, the best Army-Navy teams in decades. Going into Army-Navy, the Black Knights were 11-1, led by Heisman candidate quarterback Bryson Daly,
leading quarterbacks in rushing yards and attempts, while clinching the NCAA single-season record for rushing touchdowns. Blake Horvath, Daly's Navy counterpart, stood as another elite option quarterback, placing second among quarterbacks in yards per rush, with 30 combined rushing and passing touchdowns. The two backs would elevate each respective academy's offense to two of the nation's best. With Army joining the AAC, both would dominate the American, with the Black Knights securing their first conference title off a 35-14 blowout of the favored Tulane Green Wave. A blowout, mind you, with Daly completing 2 passes for 17 yards. Football the way God intended. In a repeat of the 1996 game, the double-digit win-bound Army Black Knights would go into Army-Navy as the clear favorites, ranked number 19 in the nation and fresh off a conference title, ready to finish the regular season on a high note with a win over a scrappy 8-win Navy squad. Like in 96, the underdog midshipmen would strike hard early, going up 14-0 midway through the second, but unlike 96, the Army comeback never materialized. Daly would cut the deficit to 4 midway through the third, but Horvath and the midshipman offense would simply prove too much, forcing Army to try to attack through the air, which all but sealed the game away. Army-Navy is a rivalry you can easily get lost in and still not cover it all. There's each academy's tradition of singing each other's alma mater after the game. There's Army and Navy's, quote, prisoner exchange. There's Navy's Keenan Reynolds and his promise to bring a helicopter escort to the Heisman ceremony. There's Army's first bowl invite and how it was blocked by the Pentagon. There's a host of pranks, a host of stories, and 134 years of football history. This is why Army-Navy, to me at least, is the collegiate rivalry. It is college football's long and illustrious history condensed into a 60-minute game held once a year, whose importance defines the two programs it involves. Army's football program exists to play Navy. Navy's football program exists to play Army, and the American public can't help but tune in each and every year.
I'd like to, again, thank my patrons.
Captain Coey, the King of War 541, William L. Jagnow, Aiden Wong, Yeah Avenue, Ryan Liu, Authentic Sims, Max Kern, Joe Sports 2022, Lance Justice, Class Jackson Lawsuit, Hoppe, October Rusto 2, Justin Pedraza, Cole, Nick Knudsen, Lurker, Trash Can Gus, Ease.L, Spicy Babe, The Erupturatan, Adrian Genge, Deatheros, Sean McWilliams, CC, The Hidden Source, Bradley Moore, at Signwood, Scarface 1, Mega Doomer, Philip, and Crosley Jones. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see y'all in the next video.